All right, here we are, week 6, part 2. This is a 2-part lecture, so there's about 22 minutes worth on part A, which you want to listen to first, and I'll try to give you another not quite 20 minutes here. We'll see how this goes. So I had you up to 1849 and the Cincinnati meeting, which founded the American Christian Missionary Society, and it was first led, formally speaking, by Alexander Campbell, who chose not to show up for the meeting. And I note that along with his stance, at least in public terms, on abolition and justice for persons enslaved and African Americans in general, is indicative of a tendency in our movement, which we still wrestle with, a desire to not face hard conflict and to try to keep everyone happy until there is an externally forced break. And well, I think you can work out the implications from there. And if you are any part of church leadership at any point in your past or present, you know how it works out when you try to keep everybody happy. So, not saying disciples are unique in having that problem in congregational life, but I would say it's definitely a strain in our history. And now I move into this next phase where, so we've gone from radical independence and the spread of the Restoration movement with Alexander Campbell's publication and teaching and preaching and Barton Stone's publication and leadership farther west. And then Stone dies 1844, Campbell picks up the ball, others start rising up. And after Campbell's death in 1866, we have a variety of publications in the field. And some of them are very strongly pushing back against cooperative missions. And in a parallel course, in most cases, they're pushing back against instrumental music, especially organs. The a cappella churches of Christ come, of course, from that division. And David Harrell, who I mentioned in the first lecture, talks about how essentially our division, which is formally recognized in 1906, really goes back decades. Absolutely amen with Dr. Harrell on that. And that it's essentially how we had a delayed reaction split to what the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Baptists, you know, the American Baptists and the Southern Baptist Convention had before the Civil War, which was an overt split over whether or not somebody could be a preacher of the gospel or even a Christian and own slaves. So those divisions the other churches had, and in most cases took them about a century to finish some kind of a healing process. Some of us say we're still working on it in much of American Christendom. But for we disciples, we hadn't had a split north-south, a split over slavery, but Harrell and others have argued that the debates over whether or not you should have instrumental music in church was, in a sense, a proxy over that same unresolved tension. And that it also, after the Civil War, carried not only the tension of Reconstruction and North versus South still struggling to find a way to restore some kind of unity and seek justice, but after 1877, when Reconstruction collapses, the first Ku Klux Klan rises up, and African Americans who have come into governance and leadership in much of the South are suddenly, and in most cases violently, expelled and then through Jim Crow laws restricted from any kind of leadership. As a nation, we struggled for a century to work that one out. And most of us would say we're still working on aspects of it. So the split with the a cappella or the non-instrumental churches of Christ, Harrell and others would say, if you're poorer, more rural, and in general, not exclusively, and there are non-instrumental churches of Christ in the North, in Ohio, probably all the way up into Minnesota, though I haven't gone there to check. But in general, the split, as it became formally recognized through David Lipscomb's statement in 1906, was largely between those poorer and more rural churches of Christ, which, to be perfectly blunt about it, started with a certain amount of, well, we can't afford the darn things. Whereas the growing urbanization in the North and the greater wealth there meant the churches said, hey, this is a great asset for worship. It enhances congregational singing. Let's get the pipe organ in here. Remember, there's no electronic amplification. So they tended more to go towards having organs and musical instruments in worship and the others not. So it's complicated. You have the debate over musical instruments in worship. You have the debate over cooperative missions, or should each congregation support its own missionaries directly? I put quotes around this because as we get to the next split, after, remember, in 1906, only the recognition of a split that goes back to the later 1800s, between 1919 and 1926, we have a growing tension still between not so much over musical instruments, and at least overtly, we're not talking about race and racial justice, but we are talking about cooperative missions and the idea of supporting individual missionaries by individual congregations, as opposed to, and this was a phrase that has been, and perhaps in some quarters within the disciples of Christ, still is used with some heat behind it, sending our money to Indianapolis. Now, for other more hierarchical denominations, it's assumed, it's expected. Among Methodists, you have apportionments. Among Presbyterians, you have per capitas. It's understood we're a part of a larger church in those traditions, and we send a certain amount of what we receive to help the wider church. That's a concept that's been hotly debated right down through restructure in 1968, and really our ability to build some kind of comity, not to say covenant, around our new polity, which dates really only to 1968, is still a work in progress. Hence all of this history, right? But in 1919, it's announced that the Old American Christian Missionary Society and some of these other missionary societies that we've talked about in previous weeks are going to come together, create office space together, create program together, reduce duplication in office staff, bookkeeping, and that sort of thing. And we will create a united Christian Missionary Society, an institution, I might add, that still exists. If you check your yearbook, you might want to find an old yearbook in a disciples church, look it up and see it's more of a holding company for assets from which proceeds help to support the wider church even today. We'll save that for the last week in a little bit more detail. But the United Christian Missionary Society is announced in 1919, gets rolling in 1920, and immediately a lot of the more independent-minded, and yes, even in the North, tends to be the more rural churches say, wait, we're going to send our money to Indianapolis. We're going to support the UCMS Octopus. And there's some lovely cartoons I wish I could pop up for you in the debate over whether or not this was something that's unbiblical and not supportive of the gospel, or as the cooperatives, the group that becomes the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, out of which I'm speaking and preaching today. No, cooperative missions affirms and encourages and supports our ability to share the good news more effectively, more widely. And is there some racial tension in the background, behind the scenes, but still alive and ugly and active in this split? I would have to say yes, but even there, it's complicated and not too convenient for a brief discussion, but this is why I wanted you to read the Cardwell and Fox book. I think all of us, whether you're a part of the African-American tradition in our church or not, can be blessed by reading their perspective on how the National Convocation came to be and why it's still necessary. And then Sandra Jha's book about the different ethnic constituencies within the church. But I'll just touch on one in this period, because after the a cappella churches of Christ split off, and as we're starting to discuss cooperative missions, there are some African-American leaders in the African-American churches that from the beginning in Midway, Kentucky, up near Bethany, Virginia, now West Virginia, African-American persons heard the gospel as taught by the Campbells and by Stone, and heard a message that spoke to them, and in many cases had to form their own churches because of prejudice and segregation within the existing churches, but they still held to these same traditions and often subscribed to the same publications, which were our authority source for that time. Well, as the churches of Christ are splitting off and as the remaining cooperatives and grudging cooperatives are starting to look towards what will become the United Christian Missionary Society in 1919, there are African-American leaders who say, I'm concerned we're going to get left to one side. We need to have our own institutions to support our own ministries. We are not a people who need to be ministered to. We'd like to be ministers along with the wider church. Preston Taylor. Preston Taylor is a giant figure, and justifiably so, perhaps to the extent that sometimes he overshadows people like Sarah Lou Bostic. So you have your assignments in the syllabus, you have your readings, but don't miss Preston Taylor. I had an African-American student one year come up to me after class and say, you know, I got to tell you, Jeff, I was doing my reading and I started thinking, was this a case kind of like Alexander Campbell or Alexander Cross, the early African-American missionaries whose names you can confuse with, well, you know, the other guys. And was there more than one Preston Taylor? And I laughed because I understood exactly what she was getting at. When you read through the history of who Preston Taylor was and what he did, it's really hard to believe this was all just one guy. He was an entrepreneur, he was a businessman, he was a banker, he was a preacher, he was a minister, he was a mortician, he was a community leader. He was, I think God gave him 28 hours in a day, while the rest of us had to get by on 24. He was anointed by God to do a very particular work, and a work which in many ways is still active among us and to our mutual blessing. So read up on Preston Taylor. But so as African-American disciples and other constituency groups start to rise up, the tensions from 1926, when those who were just opposed to the whole idea of centralization, as they put it, in Indianapolis, and common missions and any kind of church structure at all, let alone expectations and minimum criteria for ordination beyond what a local church might approve, but to say that ordination is an act of the wider church, whether of the district or of what we now call the region, or of the church as a whole. In 1926, a group of independents walked out of what was then the International Convention, what we now call General Assemblies. And they went to a nearby theater and they organized themselves and they started something called the North American Christian Convention. Even they were Canada as well as the US. And the North American Christian Convention went on for many years until really just a couple of years ago. And it was the one institution for the independent Christian churches. And this is a completely separate group from the a cappella churches of Christ. And just to keep you confused, the independents often like to refer to themselves as Church of Christ, to the point that there are some churches that had been very cooperative and committed to cooperative missions and part of what we call disciples all the way through, but who still called themselves, say, Central Church of Christ in Newark, Ohio. And it was after restructure, they finally had to change their name just to reduce the confusion. So in general, the independent Christian churches tend to be called Church of Christ, whereas we tend to call ourselves something Christian Church, and in parentheses, Disciples of Christ. And that takes us to restructure, 1968. And you've got readings enough on this subject, but we talked and we debated after World War II and very actively through the 1950s, even investigated forms of potential unity with the American Baptists, as well as with what ultimately became the United Church of Christ. And organic union never really came to pass. So by the 1960s, we said we need to have some kind of structure. We need to have some kind of way of bringing clarity to our ministerial certification process. So part of restructure, and perhaps the part that the most people objected to in some ways at the time, was that ordination became less a question of simply what a congregation would affirm about an individual, and it became an act of the wider church. And to this day, since restructure, effectively, while a congregation will play a part in ordination review, it's usually the Regional Commission on Ministry that gives the final approval, usually with a nurture and certification process along the way, which often includes taking a class like this one to get you to where you're approved for ordination, which then does take place in the local church. A salute to our roots, but the idea that a local church drives the bus the whole route for an individual's ordination process, we don't consider that to be a part of the tradition that we affirm today. That's also one of the distinctives between us and the independents who are still very much focused on individual congregations choose. But as I referred to earlier, it's also the case that although this wasn't necessarily an issue that was on the table in the tensions and debates between 1926 and the Memphis walkout and 1968 and the decision in Kansas City for us to become the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, sadly, perhaps the most emphatic distinction between us, aside from sending money to Indianapolis, is whether or not women can preach. And with very few exceptions, in independent Christian churches or churches of Christ, women cannot preach, they cannot preside at the table, and in most cases, they can't even serve at the table and usually can't teach in Sunday school, except for very young children. I can't even entirely account for how our independent siblings in the Restoration movement came to that level of separation. I think there's a lot of cultural influence more than theological doctrine, but you can say that in our entire movement, when you go back to the first decades, you go to the founders era, you didn't find really any women preaching at all. But I also want to affirm that as early as the 1880s and 1890s, cooperative missions and the effective sharing of the gospel and a just reading of scripture led many who I would consider our spiritual forebears to say, yes, women can, women should, women must preach. Our understandings about racial justice were even slower, even further behind that. After restructure, we began to come to a new understanding of what we had done and hadn't done in our past and what needed to happen in terms of full inclusion and affirmation of diversity within our church looking forward. We established the Reconciliation Office and the Reconciliation Offering, and we continue to find ways to work together across ethnic and, well, other dividing lines that used to separate us. But we are very much a work in progress. As a movement for unity, we have at least two major splits behind us, though, and we continue to wrestle with what it means to be a movement for unity, while within our own movement, we've struggled to achieve that. I hope that's a subject we can talk about in the discussion board, and I hope your readings help you get to a better understanding of this as we continue to work and discuss and get even closer to the end of this class, where you'll have a better understanding of our history and polity and how to tell this story to others who come and ask, so who are these disciples? I appreciate your listening to 2 lectures this week, and we'll pick up again as usual for next week. Go in peace.